Hi, everyone. I'm Lynn Cremando, and I'm here today with Dr. Baxter Bell.
Hi, everyone.
Baxter's a frequent contributor, and anyone in our YogaU family, I'm sure, is familiar. So he's one of those people who needs no introduction. And yet, Baxter, I'm going to introduce you.
All right. What do you got to say?
I'm going to say this. Trained and working as a family physician with a busy practice, Baxter figured out about 20 years ago that his message of vitality, healthy aging, and living your best life would be more effectively delivered in the yoga studio versus the doctor's office. So he became a certified yoga teacher first, did lots of teaching, lots of teacher trainings, then became a yoga therapist. He's certified by the International Association of Yoga Therapists, and he's also on the board and a frequent speaker at the annual Sitar conference. He's the co-founder and past contributor to the wildly popular blog, Yoga for Healthy Aging, and has co-authored with Nina Zolotow the book of the same name. And his new blog is called What's on Your Yoga Mind. So that wasn't too painful, was it?
Not bad at all. Thank you, Lynn. Appreciate the kind words.
So, Baxter, if there was ever a time for a bat signal in the shape of an Om sign up in the sky for the superpowers of yoga, we're there.
Yes.
As we come into year 3 of this pandemic, and we seem to be working our way through the alphabet of variants.
Mm-hmm.
One thing has become eminently clear, and it's that this virus is unlike any other virus, because in a lot of cases, you don't have the virus and then you had the virus. You have the virus and then you have the other sort of the long version of the virus. So we know that it can leave an incredibly long-lasting footprint. And I know you've been studying these effects of this post-acute COVID, or what's commonly called long COVID. And that's what I want to pick your brain about today. So could you start by explaining what is long haul? It's called so many things, called long haul, it's called long COVID, but really it's the COVID after the COVID. It's what makes this virus, I think, different from any other virus.
Well, that's a really good question to pose, because we don't know for sure if it's necessarily different from other viruses. And I'll give the example of another condition that's been around for a long time that's been also quite mysterious. And that is what has been previously called chronic fatigue syndrome. And when you look at the most common preludes that people who develop chronic fatigue syndrome, which now has another name that we'll get into in my course, but a more formalized name that's come about in the last year or so. What you find is that one of the top 3 things that patients report is an extremely severe flu case prior to later on developing chronic fatigue syndrome. Interesting. Viral infection causing possibly a post-viral syndrome that interestingly shares many of the same symptoms that people who had acute COVID or even asymptomatic COVID, which is the other stinker about this thing, and have gone on to develop this thing that we're calling long COVID. Again, there are lots of names. I'll get into all of that good, juicy detail in my upcoming course, but that you have this other thing that lingers on beyond what we would expect. And, it's already, even with acute COVID, keep in mind that it doesn't behave like a typical flu. In some ways it does. It has many of the same symptoms, but it often lingers twice as long. If you're going to recover completely, it still lingers like twice as long as a normal flu would, right? Normally we'd get a flu bug, it would be 7 to 10 days, and we'd probably be able to go back to work. And, we might not be at 100% energy, but our acute symptoms have resolved, our appetite is back, our energy's on the upswing, and we can get back to things. With acute COVID, people often are not feeling well for well into 4 or 5 weeks. And so already we have a situation where a coronavirus, and there have been coronaviruses before, this isn't a brand new subset of viruses. it's a new kind of coronavirus, right? So we've had other coronaviruses, like in the SARS epidemic from years back. But it has some of these amazing, unique features. And now we have this unusual situation in which a certain percentage of people who get acute or even asymptomatic COVID exposure and they have the virus, they will go on to develop this syndrome, which is a constellation of symptoms that can persist now for as long as the pandemic's been going on. There are people who came down with the symptoms of long COVID in March or April of 2020 in the United States and are still having symptoms to this day, right? And yeah, so that's the reality of it. Some people have resolved, but many people haven't, and there's no clear picture on what really causes this. What is the underlying insult other than the initial exposure to COVID? We don't know, why does this linger on? Why are these symptoms here? Why are they so widespread? There are theories, but we still actually don't know much about that.
You mentioned the chronic fatigue syndrome, which I think is another kind of autoimmune condition. Mm-hmm. But what I think, and why I think of this as being different from other viruses, is people think of COVID as being something that's in the respiratory system. They think of it as coughing or I can't breathe. But I have clients with long haul COVID who have cognitive issues, who can't remember things, who have gait problems, who are having problems with that seem to be completely unrelated. One of my clients had a mini stroke as a result of her COVID. Neurovascular, cardiovascular, chronic nausea, these don't seem on the surface to be related. What they do seem to point to is a kind of an autonomic nervous system gone off the rails, because you could kind of relate all of that. I think you're the doctor. That's why you're here.
Well, I think that we can't relate it all to the autonomic nervous system, but certainly some of the symptoms definitely are probably a result of autonomic dysregulation, meaning the autonomic nervous system is no longer kind of self-regulating in the normal way that it would. And, even before we, have encountered long COVID as yoga teachers and yoga therapists and yoga practitioners, we've been talking for a long time about how many people have a dysregulated autonomic nervous system. Maybe not to the extent we're seeing with long COVID, right? But we have seen that. And in fact, one of the main theories on how yoga is therapeutically beneficial is that it helps us to rebalance our autonomic nervous system, right? So we know that, at least, in ways that when things are mild to moderately out of balance, we can come back into balance more easily. So I would agree with you that some of the symptoms definitely are connected to an autonomic nervous system that is dysregulated. Some of them may turn out to be autoimmune related, which is not exactly the same thing. I mean, an autoimmune condition could affect our autonomic nervous system for sure, but an autoimmune system could certainly affect many other things outside of the area of the autonomic nervous system, right? It could target, like, as an example, rheumatoid arthritis, right? Rheumatoid arthritis is an is an autoimmune condition. Right. I'm getting my automatics and my autoimmunes mixed up. I know. It's an autoimmune condition that specifically attacks the inside of joints, right? So it's not necessarily dealing with the autonomic nervous system specifically. So in the same way, many of the symptoms in long COVID could be attributed to other processes going on. And again, the big issue is we can say that a person with long COVID has some autonomic dysregulation, but we don't know exactly why they have the autonomic dysregulation. We don't know what the underlying precipitators are. They're starting to form some theories. There's theories about autoimmune. There's theories about underlying inflammatory issues. There's this observation that there are these autonomic dysregulatory things going on. But again, there's no cohesive understanding of why that's going on. if we go back to acute COVID for a moment, are you okay if we pop back there for a moment? You know, when people get acute COVID, yeah, the vast majority of people have respiratory issues for sure. That's the way the virus gets into our body, right? It comes in through the passageways of the nose and the lungs, and then it causes both local problems. But then if you look past the surface stories, and if you've been like me reading the daily reports from the New York Times for now, 18, 19 months, every day I read that just to see what's new that I might not have seen otherwise. You were reading about the multi-system effects of even acute COVID-19, right? So acute COVID-19 was very quickly seen to cause heart issues, to cause kidney failure, to cause liver issues. There was even evidence of acute COVID-19 infections also affecting the brain and affecting cognition. So when you think about the moderate to severe cases that were often in the hospital, they weren't just dealing with respiratory issues. That certainly led to being put on a respirator and could lead to death if they didn't turn around, but they were also discovering all these other organ systems were impacted. So those folks, when they recovered, could go home having survived COVID acutely, and they're probably already going to have lingering effects in the kidneys or in the liver or in the heart, right? And that's unrelated to long COVID. This is simply post-acute COVID, a complication of their severe infection, right? The weird thing is, with long COVID, a lot of these folks had very mild infections. Some of them had a cold and might not even have thought that they had long COVID, but then they developed this whole constellation of symptoms after the fact. And when you look at them with MRIs and CT scans and other high-tech evaluations, they don't show the obvious tissue changes that you might have seen in the people that had been hospitalized with severe COVID, where you could document actual tissue changes. You know, you could see the organs were damaged and they were different. In these folks, you see they have symptoms, but oftentimes their laboratory evaluations, many of them will look pretty normal, which was why back last year in April and May and June, when these people started going to their doctors and saying, there is something wrong with me. I can't get out of bed. I can't do my normal work. I can't keep 2 or 3 thoughts happening consecutively. There's something wrong with me. The doctors would run the appropriate tests and they'd say, everything looks fine. I think you're going to be better, but there's nothing I don't have anything I can treat. If you're having trouble sleeping, I can give you some sleeping medication. If you're having trouble with what feels like wheezing, we could try an asthma inhaler. If you're having really bad headaches, I can give you some medication. So they do have symptomatic treatment for the symptoms, but they have no way of addressing whatever the underlying issue is yet, right? There is no specific treatment for long COVID. There is symptomatic treatment and general lifestyle management recommendations, but there's actually no like medication treatments or radiation, or there's like, when we think about something as devastating as a cancer diagnosis, we've got tons of tools to try and attack and kill the cancer cells that are causing the cancer. We don't have that for long COVID. The virus has left the house, and in its wake, it's almost like that poem by Rumi, right? You know, that it swept the house clean of all the furniture, and it's like, what has just happened? Why I'm in this state, right?
The other weird thing I think is at least for some of my clients, it seems to come in waves.
Yes.
So I have a client who I thought was on the mend, and she came in last week and she had just bonked.
Exactly, and we'll be certainly addressing that. It's a key feature of this condition that every yoga teacher and every individual who has the condition has to keep reminding themselves that this is not a linear progression of getting better gradually over time. It is literally an up and down, and we don't know when that ascent towards full health will take place. As I said, some people have recovered, but many people continue to struggle since they first developed their symptoms. A colleague of mine who I have interfaced around her journey with long COVID, she's in England, She mentioned the same thing. She said the toughest thing is from day to day, I don't know what I'm going to encounter when I get up the next morning, right? And so, unfortunately, it forces a beginner's mind for the individual who is being affected, because at the start of each day, especially if they're going to be trying to apply, the recommendations from their healthcare team, and maybe they're going to work with a yoga teacher or yoga therapist, they're going to have to really stop and check in very clearly after they've gotten up to say, where am I at? What can I tell about how I'm doing right now before I decide what I'm going to do for self-care and what I'm going to try and do around my activities of daily living? And am I even going to try and do my work today? Do I have that? Do I have the resources in my body to actually do the things I need to do? So it is not linear. It is not like getting a typical flu. Again, if I got the flu, I'd be sick for 7 to 10 days, and then I would have a linear, even exponential improvement over the course of 2 to 3 weeks. I'd be, in a month, I would be going, oh, when did I have the flu? I can't even remember when it was.
Brain fog. You wouldn't be expecting to go, what day is this again? So I want to go back to the bat signal in the sky, the Om signal, calling forth the yoga superpowers, because in the face of what you're saying, there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of anxiety, and there's so much of what we don't know. And there's so much medicine that isn't going to do the job until they figure out how to do the job. But there's a lot of tools of self-regulation. And I want to pull the lens back a little bit, because the person who has long COVID typically is a person who's living in a family, who's a breadwinner, who has a job, who has certain expectations about what they'll be doing when they get up in the morning, as you have mentioned. So just to pull the screen back again, long COVID doesn't just affect the person who has it, it affects the whole village around them. Mm-hmm. And the tools that we could use for the headache versus what we need to do to come back to a state, both the people who have COVID and the people who are supporting the people with long COVID. Because I had mentioned to you before, when I had 8 years of chronic pain, everybody around me just got bored with my stuff. Like they didn't want to hear about it anymore. It's a lonely place to be. So can you talk about the superpower tools of yoga and how we can wrap our arms around ourselves and others in the face of needing, and we could go back to that idea of the vagus nerve and the regulation and all this self-regulation.
Well, that's all part of it, isn't it? I think it's what I call the global benefits of yoga. And that is, it addresses the individual, it can address specific conditions or concerns, but it has also a beautiful, more generalized impact on mental, emotional well-being, on addressing feelings of depression and anxiety. And we have some studies that look at the benefits of yoga practices for caregivers and the burnout that they experience if you're the partner of someone with long COVID, if you're a husband or a wife or a lover, whatever it might be, whatever your relationship is, but you're providing support for that person. As you mentioned, it's not that people get bored, they literally get burnt out. They don't know what to do to help. And so they, in a sense, they stop being as responsive because they literally don't know what to do to help you, right? In your case, it was with persistent pain for 8 years, which, there was, again, in that setting, which is kind of similar to what long COVID folks, they don't know if and when things are going to resolve.
Right.
You do not know if or when things are going to resolve. So in that setting of uncertainty, I think one of our goals would be, how can we utilize the tools of yoga as the healthcare systems start to set up, and they're starting to do this, they're creating long COVID clinics or post-COVID care clinics, but they're just getting them together, right? They don't even have them together. There might be 1 or 2 up and running, maybe 3 in the United States in research hospitals, but as a rule, they don't exist yet, right? So there's funding coming, these things are gonna happen, but the yoga could be utilized to assist the individual and the family unit and the community, right? So that we can actually have rings of support that get larger and larger to hold the larger community together as well, the city, the state you live in, et cetera, the region that you're from, that we can utilize these tools to support on many, many levels.
Now, you have a course coming up, as you mentioned, and you're going to delve into all things long COVID.
Yes.
And you're going to give practical ideas, I'm assuming, about some of those tools.
Right.
Can you tell a little bit about the?
Yeah.
So
I can give you a little idea of what I'm hoping to cover. Yeah. So I'm going to start. I'm excited about this course because since March of 2020, after the initial shock and worry and concern and fear that came up for me and my family and everybody I knew about what this whole thing was going to be about, this pandemic that was happening, I got really curious. And probably, with my background as a family physician and having, treated the flus and the colds and the sinus infections for well over a decade in my private practice, I was curious about how this was similar and different. And so I've been following this whole pandemic as it's unfolded. And I've been able to participate in some larger symposium, one that took place in India last year, one this year that took place and was put on by a British organization, Give Back Yoga. And so, I've been kind of really looking at it and digesting it and excited about what I'm finding in the sense of my curiosity was really piqued. So I'm going to try and give a little bit of a historical context of the early pandemic, the evolution of acute COVID, the first realizations of long COVID, and kind of some of the key features of acute COVID that might blend in and explain a little bit about what's going on with long COVID, even though we still don't know if that's exactly what's going on. Talk about some of the things we know and what we still don't know. I'm excited to share a little bit about a white paper, or I shouldn't call it a white paper, a position paper that came out last year from some pretty high-powered researchers around the United States that have one foot in Western medicine and one foot in the yoga world, and the recommendations they made to the Western medical community. Talk about that and why they think yoga tools are powerful adjuncts that should be added to the treatment of the pandemic in general. So all aspects of the pandemic. And then looking at conditions like chronic fatigue syndrome and saying, well, what did they do? What do they do for people that are suffering with that chronic condition? What are the guidelines? What are some of the practices they found helpful? And could those be applicable to long COVID? And I think there are some takeaways that we could kind of utilize in guiding what we're doing. And then talking a little bit about this nonlinear aspect of the condition and how we have to really individualize the yoga tools that we choose to utilize. And even the way that we teach things like pranayama, we wouldn't necessarily just, for example, just jump in and start teaching a full 3-part inhalation and exhalation, which could probably send someone into a breathless panic who had long COVID if that was part of their symptom constellation. But instead, utilizing some more subtle breath techniques that other presenters here on YogaU have talked about in the recent past, and I'll talk about that as well, and utilize some of those newer ideas around pranayama, because I think they really, really are going to be powerful in the setting of long COVID as well. And so we'll talk a little bit about the tools of yoga, talk about how you might design a practice for yourself or someone else. If you're a yoga teacher working with someone, I'll give some encouragements about getting more education and training around stuff that you don't understand, because this is a fairly complex and new and poorly understood condition. And so it's okay as a yoga teacher or even as a yoga therapist to say, I don't know, to your clients, and say, I need to go get a little more information. And then if I feel comfortable that I've got some good ideas for you, we'll come back and we'll work together. But I think it's perfectly okay to say, I don't know and I'm not comfortable, if you're not ready to dive into that right away. And then we'll do a little recap, and I'll kind of give you a sense of what we've covered, and hopefully you'll have some nice things to work with. And I've created a really nice 1-hour practice that tries to highlight some of the concepts and ideas that I'll be talking about in the 2 lectures that you'll be getting with the program. So I think it'll give you a nice starting place. And like a lot of things, I think this is a starting place. In my mind, I imagine a year from now, 18 months from now, we might come back together on YogaU and give an update on long COVID. By then, we might have some actual studies done specifically on long COVID. Right now, we don't have any that look at yoga and long COVID, they don't exist. But there are people that are developing research protocols utilizing yoga practices that can be then tested. And so we're hoping that some of those things are going to get started in the near future, and that soon we'll have more information that we can work from. And maybe there'll be some refinements, maybe things that we'll be talking about in this course will be obsolete, and we'll have to update our information, just like we have to update our computer program periodically, right? To get rid of the glitches and keep the good stuff.
Speaking of long hauls, it sounds like we're just at the beginning of figuring out this is going to be with us for a while, even
Yes,
if we get through the next, we're
the next variant, whatever that might be. Yeah.
Omicron. I don't know the Greek alphabet, so I don't know what the next one is. Gertrude, I don't know, but I don't know the next letter, but for all I know, the next time we speak, we'll be into a different variant, but it does seem like we're at the beginning of a very long haul that yoga teachers, yoga therapists, yoga students should all be paying attention.
Absolutely. And I think that it could be a very, a place where we could find ourselves very useful and being a benefit to our communities. And so I think that the opportunity to serve is there in our capacity as yoga professionals. And I'm excited for those people that join us for this talk who are yoga professionals to consider this as an area that they're open to working with folks as they get more education and feel more comfortable trying some things out with folks.
It's interesting because you did, as a doctor yourself, point out the sort of it's not even a bad thing. It's not even a weakness, but medicine isn't there yet. But these ancient tools are there. And if you've regulated your system better, sometimes I think you can boost your immune response to things by just sleeping better and feeling better and
Absolutely.
breathing.
Yeah.
All of those,
like breathing through your nose instead of breathing through your mouth.
of
Right?
course.
Nose breathers have much better health outcomes than mouth breathers when it comes to chronic illness and infection. So there are some simple things that we can do, and then there's some that might be more complex. But the good news is that my approach is that we actually start with the simplest, most basic parts of our yoga toolkit, and they can be extremely powerful. That simple is powerful.
Awesome. Simple is powerful. I can't wait to come back and watch your course and do the practice. I'll see you here very soon.
All right. Thank you
So much for lots of information as always, and we'll see you back in this space really soon.
Excellent. Look forward to it.